My name is Gerald Fenwick. I'm 57 years old, and I have spent 40 years pouring concrete, framing houses, and teaching my son that a man doesn't raise his voice to win an argument. So when my son's bride looked my wife in the eye, called her a leech in front of 300 guests at a banquet hall outside Hamilton, and told her she wasn't welcome at her own son's wedding, every part of me wanted to come across that table. Instead, I stood up, buttoned my jacket, took my wife's hand, her cheek still burning red from where that woman's palm had landed, and I walked her out of the room without saying a single word to anyone. My brother thought I'd gone soft. The bride's family thought they'd won. Before I tell you what happened after that, hit subscribe and drop the province you're watching from in the comments. It helps more than you'd think. Now let me back up, because none of this started at that wedding. It started 3 years earlier, and it started with a foundation, the same way everything in my life does. I spent 35 years as a general contractor in southern Ontario, mostly residential builds, a few commercial jobs when the housing market went sideways in '08. I started as an apprentice carpenter at 19, worked my way up, and eventually had my own crew and my own name on the trucks. Fenwick Construction. Nothing glamorous, no condo towers downtown, just solid work and a reputation that took 3 decades to earn and about 90 seconds to lose, as I'd find out. My wife Margaret is 55. We met at a curling bonspiel in Barrie when I was 26, and I drove 2 hours every Friday that winter just to watch her throw rocks with her sister's league. We've been married 29 years. She taught piano out of our living room for most of that time, still has 11 students who come by on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She's the kind of woman who remembers everyone's birthday, who shows up to the hospital with a casserole before you've even called her, who has never once, not one time in 29 years, said an unkind word about another person in my presence. Our son Connor is 29, sharp, ambitious, started his own architectural consulting firm 4 years ago. I have never been prouder of anything than I was the day he signed the lease on that little office in Barrie. I helped where I could, not money, he never took a dime from me, but contacts, advice, showing up when he needed someone to talk through a problem. I want to be honest with you. I made mistakes with Connor long before any of this happened. When he was 23, he got tangled up with an investor who turned out to be running half his portfolio on borrowed money. I sat him down, told him straight, and he didn't speak to me for 2 months. After that, I told myself I'd pick my battles. What I didn't understand, what took me most of my adult life to figure out, is that every battle I didn't fight taught my son that I never really would fight for anything. And the woman he eventually brought home had read that about me before I'd read it about myself. Connor brought Vivian home for the first time on a Sunday in late September, about 2 years before the wedding. She was 26, polished, the kind of beautiful that makes you understand immediately why your son has that particular look on his face. Like he's holding something fragile he isn't sure he deserves. She shook my hand, firm and direct. With Margaret it was different. Margaret had made her shepherd's pie, set the table with the good dishes, and when Vivian walked into the kitchen, Margaret opened her arms the way she does for everyone. Vivian offered her a stiff hug, barely contact, already glancing past her shoulder at the house. I noticed something else that night. She looked at me the way you'd size up a locked door, figuring out if there was a way through it. Not rude, never technically rude, but calculating. My younger sister Donna, no, that's not right, I mean my sister-in-law, Pam, drove up from Aurelia that weekend and cornered me in the garage after dinner. "Gerald," she said, "that girl is sizing up your whole life." I told her she was being unfair. I told myself she was just being protective. A few weeks later, Connor mentioned, almost in passing, that before that first dinner, Vivian had asked him what his parents owned outright, whether the house had a mortgage left on it, what Fenwick Construction actually pulled in a year. I noted it. I didn't act on it. That was my first real mistake, and telling Pam she was wrong was my second. The 2 years that followed were a slow erosion, the kind you can't point to and say, "There, that's the moment it started." It was always just barely within the range of things you could excuse if you wanted to badly enough. Vivian forgot Margaret's birthday dinner twice, remembered only the afternoon of. When Margaret told stories at the table, and she has good ones, 20 years of piano students, recitals gone sideways, one boy who threw up on the Steinway mid-Chopin. Vivian would check her phone, turn slightly away, just enough to make Margaret lose her thread mid-sentence. She stopped speaking to Margaret directly somewhere around month 8. Everything routed through Connor. Tell your mom we can't make it Sunday. Let your parents know we'll be late for Thanksgiving. Connor became the wire strung between two poles that were never allowed to touch directly, and my Margaret, who has never asked anyone for anything in her life, started arriving at family dinners with an apology, already loaded into her posture, second-guessing herself before she'd even opened her mouth. She'd glance at me across the table sometimes with a look that asked, "Am I doing something wrong here?" That's the part I could never forgive. Not what Vivienne did to me, what she did to my wife's ease in her own family. When Connor called to say they were engaged, Margaret cried happy tears right there in the kitchen and started planning a celebration dinner before she'd even hung up the phone. I went out and sat on the back deck for a long while before I could make myself go back inside and smile. 2 days later, my oldest friend, Trevor Aldis, we met at Mohawk College in 1987, both of us broke and living on craft dinner, called to check in. He'd heard about the engagement secondhand. "You sound off, Gerald," he said. "I'm fine, thinking mostly. About what? Whether I've been patient with that boy or just absent. I'm not sure, those are different things." Trevor went quiet a second, then said, "Ask me again after the wedding." Vivienne's parents threw the engagement party 3 weeks after the ring went on. A private room at a steakhouse downtown. The kind of place where the cloth napkins cost more than our first car payment did in 1991. The invitation came 4 days before the event, printed, slid under our door rather than mailed, like a notice from a landlord rather than family. We went, of course. You go. Her mother, a woman named Roberta, who wore her pearls like armor, greeted us at the door with a smile that said how nice of you to come in a tone that made it clear we were guests, not family. She introduced us to 3 people in the first 10 minutes and got our last name wrong twice. Not maliciously, just because she'd never bothered learning it. Our seats were at a table near the kitchen pass-through. You could hear every dish hit the counter. During the toasts, Vivienne's father spoke for nearly 9 minutes about the family's history in commercial real estate, about his daughter's accomplishments, about the bright future ahead. He mentioned Connor warmly, twice. He did not mention us once. Vivienne came by our table late in the evening, touched Margaret's arm and said, "So glad you two could make it, the Fenwicks." The exact tone you'd use thanking a neighbor for shoveling your walk. I excused myself for the washroom, and on my way back I passed an alcove where Roberta was murmuring to a friend, "At least Connor's driven. The father seems like he never left the job site." I stood there a second, straightened my jacket, and went back to our table. I never told Margaret what I heard. I just found her hand under the tablecloth and held it the rest of the night. But I remembered every word of it. 3 months before the wedding, the venue's stage and lighting contractor backed out, double booked, license lapsed, something. Connor called me on a Wednesday night, his voice tight, and asked if I could pull a crew together fast, get it built right, make it look like nothing had gone wrong. He asked me specifically not to mention it to Vivienne. I called in a favor from a subcontractor I'd worked with for almost 20 years. 48 hours later, the stage was up, to code. Better than what they'd originally booked. No invoice. No announcement. 2 weeks after that, Connor called again, different tone entirely. "Dad, Vivienne found out." "Found out what?" "That you fixed the stage thing. She feels like you went around her." I let that sit a moment. "Connor, you called me." "I know, Dad, but she feels like you're trying to make yourself necessary. Can you just back off? Please. Just until after the wedding." "All right," I said. "I'll back off." I hung up and sat by the kitchen window a long while. Not angry exactly. Something closer to grief, the slow kind you don't notice creeping up until you're already standing in it. The rehearsal dinner was 60 people in a private room at her parents' club. White linen, a slideshow set up at the end of the room running on a loop for about 10 minutes. I counted, 18 photos. Connor and Vivienne at a cottage on Georgian Bay. Connor golfing with her father. Vivienne at her university convocation, her sister's wedding, a charity gala I'd never heard mentioned once. Not one photo of Margaret, not one of me, not one of Connor before Vivienne existed in his life. Margaret sat beside me through all 18 slides with that same small, careful smile she used to wear at parent-teacher meetings when a parent was upset with her. The smile that says, "I'm fine. This is fine." When Connor stood to give his toast, he thanked his groomsmen by name, thanked Vivienne's family at length, thanked his closest friends. Then, almost as an afterthought, "And of course, Mom, Dad, thanks for being here." The same line you'd give a coworker who covered your shift on short notice. I stood when he finished, crossed the room, shook his hand, and pulled him close enough that only he could hear me. I love you, I always will, but there's a moment coming where you'll have to decide what kind of man you're going to be. Not for me, not for her, for yourself. He looked at me like he didn't understand the words. Across the room, Vivian watched the two of us with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not concern, not guilt, something closer to recalculating. On the drive back to the hotel, my sister-in-law Pam called. Gerald, I overheard Vivian telling one of her bridesmaids she was going to handle the Margaret situation tomorrow. For good. I stared at the highway lights a long time after that call ended. I didn't sleep, not from fear, but because I already knew tomorrow was the last day, anything could stay the way it currently was. Saturday morning, the hotel room smelled like coffee Margaret had made at 6, because neither of us had managed to sleep past 5:30 anyway. I was knotting my tie in the bathroom mirror when she appeared in the doorway in her dress, a deep blue, the one she'd driven to 3 different shops to find, tried on 4 times before she was sure. She looked at her reflection beside mine. Do I look all right? 29 years, and it's always the same question before every recital, every holiday, every moment that actually matters. I set my tie down, turned and straightened the little corsage pinned near her shoulder. You look like the woman I drove 2 hours through a snowstorm to watch throw curling rocks. You always have. She smiled, and then it faded at the edges. Promise me today will be okay, Gerald. I looked at her, at the care she'd put into this morning, into being exactly the right kind of mother-in-law on her son's wedding day. I promise we'll handle whatever happens, together. It wasn't the answer she wanted, and she knew it, but she nodded anyway. Before we left, I texted Trevor, if I call you today, pick up. He answered inside a minute. Always, the venue was 20 minutes out, a banquet hall overlooking a golf course near Waterdown. When we pulled in, I spotted Vivian near the entrance in her gown, talking to her mother. She saw us arrive. No wave. She looked at Margaret, the way you look at a problem you've already decided how you're going to solve. My jaw set. I got out, came around, opened Margaret's door, offered her my arm. Let's go. 300 people fill a room differently than you'd expect. It's not the noise. It's the weight of being witnessed by that many strangers at once. Chandeliers threw warm light across round tables draped in cream linen, centerpieces that probably cost more than my first truck. A string trio played something I didn't recognize near the windows. Our table was number 8, near the back, by the corridor to the kitchen. Pam had already found her seat and squeezed my arm without a word when I sat down. The seating chart put Connor and Vivian's sweetheart table at the far end, flanked by her parents on one side and a wall of white floral arrangements on the other. Between us and them, 5 full tables, 300 guests, and a kind of social architecture that says everything without anyone having to say a thing. The ceremony was short and traditional. Connor looked terrified and happy in the particular way grooms always do. He glanced back at our table once during the processional. One look, then turned forward, and I understood that was probably all we were going to get. At cocktail hour, a man at our table asked what I did for work. General contracting, 35 years. He nodded the way people nod when they've heard exactly what they expected and already lost interest, then turned to talk to the man on his other side. Margaret found my hand under the table. I let her take it. I sat there in my good suit at table 8 by the kitchen door and thought, this is what we've been reduced to in our own son's life. I was wrong about one part of that thought, though. We hadn't been reduced. We'd been positioned, and Vivian wasn't finished yet. Dinner and toasts opened with the usual choreography. Vivian worked the room table by table, a bride's procession through her kingdom, touching shoulders, laughing at the right moments. She reached our table last, slowed barely, glanced past Margaret toward Pam, gave a small wave at no one in particular, and kept walking. Her mother made up for it about 10 minutes later, appearing at Margaret's shoulder with a glass of champagne and the warmth of someone running for municipal council. Margaret, darling, that dress is lovely. A beat. Very practical. Practical. Not elegant, not beautiful. Practical, like a pair of winter boots, like a choice made by a woman who didn't know any better. Thank you, Margaret said, and meant it, the way she always means everything. No armor, no edge, because that's simply who she is. I set my fork down. Pam leaned in and murmured, Gerald, we could leave after dinner. There's no rule that says we have to be his parents tonight, I said. We stay. Across the room, Connor was laughing at something one of his groomsmen said, looking genuinely at ease, and I watched him a moment trying to find the 23-year-old who used to call me from job sites, just to tell me he'd learned something new that week. Then Vivienne broke off from a cluster of guests near the head table and walked toward us. Not the wide social walk she'd used with everyone else, but direct, deliberate. She pulled out the empty chair across from Margaret and sat. Her expression wasn't a smile anymore. It was an ending. She folded her hands on the tablecloth and spoke low, not quiet out of discretion, but in the way a person speaks when they want to be heard clearly by everyone immediately around them without technically shouting. "Margaret, I think we need to talk about some things." Margaret set her water glass down. "Of course, Vivienne, whatever you need." What followed was a list, delivered flat and even, which somehow made it worse. Vivienne said Margaret had pressured Connor into letting his father fix the stage problem. She said Margaret had been creating obligations Connor felt he couldn't refuse. She said Margaret had been saying unflattering things about her at the rehearsal dinner. Margaret's face went very still. "Vivienne, I'm not finished." The table beside us had gone quiet. "I just want us to be clear about what this relationship looks like going forward. Connor and I need space to build our lives, and that means boundaries." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand. I'm sorry if She was apologizing again for something she hadn't done, trained into the reflex by 100 small moments like this one. I put my hand flat on the table, calm, deliberate. "Vivienne, that's not what happened with the contractor. Connor called me." She turned to me sharp. "I'm speaking to Margaret." The table next to us had fully stopped talking now. Across the room, 10 feet from the bar, Connor was watching. He'd heard. His glass was halfway to his mouth and frozen there. He didn't move toward us. I looked at my son across 40 feet of hardwood floor and chandelier light and didn't recognize him. Margaret began to rise, graceful the way she does everything. "Vivienne, maybe this is better saved for another time. Today is your no." Vivienne stood with her. Her voice climbed one register, audible now to 2, maybe 3 tables. "We're talking about this now. I'm tired of it, being pushed off." She turned slightly toward the room, drawing it in as witness. "I know you've been talking about me to people here, I know it." "That isn't true," Margaret said very quietly. "Don't tell me what's true." Vivienne stepped forward, 1 step. "You've been trying to undermine me in my own marriage since the day Connor brought me home, and I am done pretending otherwise." She slapped Margaret across the face. Not a glancing thing, not a shock of contact and reflex. A real, deliberate blow, the kind that turns a head and leaves a sound hanging in the air like a struck bell that won't stop ringing. The string trio stopped mid-note. The room went from 300 people talking to 300 people holding their breath, all in about 1 second. Vivienne straightened, looked at the red mark rising on my wife's cheek, and her voice carried clean across the suddenly silent hall. "Get out of here, you leech. Nobody wants you here. This is our day." Connor was still at the bar. He set his glass down slowly. He looked at his mother, at the mark on her face, at Vivienne standing there like a verdict had just been read out, and he said nothing, not one word. Pam was already on her feet beside me. I put a hand on her shoulder. "Sit down, Pam." I stood up. The room was still holding its breath, 300 people deciding whether to look or look away, and most of them choosing wrong. I walked around to Margaret's side of the table, took the white cloth napkin from beside her plate, and held it gently against her cheek. Not because there was anything to wipe, but because she'd just been struck in front of 300 strangers, and deserved one moment of being looked after. I set the napkin down, helped her to her feet, straightened her corsage, the same way I had in the hotel room that morning. Then I buttoned my jacket, turned, and looked at the room. Not at Vivienne, not at Roberta. At the room itself, the faces who'd just watched my wife get struck and would spend the rest of their lives deciding what they thought about it. I found Connor across the floor. He was staring at his shoes. I looked at him long enough that eventually he looked up. "We'll talk later, son." 4 words, no anger in them. Just the particular weight of something finally being decided. I offered Margaret my arm. She took it. We walked out. Near the back, past table 3, an older man in a dark suit caught my eye as we passed and gave one slow nod. The kind that means I saw all of it. I nodded back. Outside, the October air was cold, and the parking lots were quiet, and my wife was shaking very slightly against my arm, and I held on to her and didn't say a single word until she was ready to. Pam found us by the car 10 minutes later, didn't ask any questions, just stood there in her good heels on the cold asphalt, and kept Margaret company while I sat on the hood and looked up at the sky. Margaret spoke first. "Why didn't he?" She stopped. Started again. "Connor. Why didn't he say anything?" Nobody answered her. There wasn't an answer that would have helped. In the car, none of us said much. Halfway to the hotel, Margaret put her hand over mine on the gear shift. I don't want to lose him, Gerald. I know. Promise me we won't lose him. I kept my eyes on the road. We're not going to lose Connor, but we're going to have to decide what we're willing to accept to keep him. And I'll tell you right now, it isn't this. It can't be this. She was quiet a long moment, then nodded once and looked out her window. At the hotel, after Pam had gone to her own room and Margaret was finally asleep, I sat in the chair by the window with my phone for a long time. I called Trevor. He picked up on the second ring. I'm in the parking lot of the venue still, Gerald, he said before I'd even gotten a word out. I saw the whole thing. Tell me what you need. Trevor Aldous and I met in 1987 at Mohawk College, split textbooks and gas money for 4 years, stood up at each other's weddings, called each other after every significant thing that ever happened to either of us. His divorce, my father's stroke, Margaret's health scare in 2014 that thank God turned out to be nothing. He'd spent the last 18 years building a development company out of Hamilton that had grown well past anything either of us would have guessed back in our dorm room. His firm was currently the lead developer on the Lakeshore Commons project, a mixed-use complex going up along the waterfront, the largest build the region had seen in 15 years. They were in the final stretch of selecting specialty consultants. 3 months earlier, Connor's firm had submitted a proposal for the architectural and interior coordination contract. His biggest pitch yet, he'd told me, practically vibrating with excitement on the phone. He had no idea Trevor sat on the selection committee. He'd never once thought to ask. I hadn't told him, not to keep a secret. There had simply never been a reason to, until now. We talked 30 minutes in that parking lot, Trevor told me later. The committee had been impressed with the technical work, but the final stage involved character references and professional network vetting. Standard practice for a contract that size. What do you want me to do, Gerald? He asked. I thought about the mark rising on Margaret's cheek, about Connor frozen at the bar, with his glass halfway to his mouth, saying nothing. I don't want you to hurt him, I said. I just need you to stop covering for him the way I always have. Let whatever happens, happen. Trevor was quiet a moment. Understood. That was all. Connor called at 11:20 that night. The phone buzzed on the nightstand and Margaret stirred in her sleep. I took it into the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub. Dad, he said, voice carrying the careful evenness of a man reciting a line he'd rehearsed. I think we should talk about tonight. All right, I'm listening. Vivienne was under a lot of stress. The whole day it was a lot. She didn't mean it the way it came out. She's going to call Mom tomorrow and apologize. I said nothing. Dad, she wants to fix this. Connor, your wife struck your mother across the face in front of 300 people. I kept my voice level, and you stood there. The silence on the other end told me I'd landed exactly where I needed to. I know, he said finally, quiet. I need you to sit with that before we talk about Vivienne's intentions, or her stress level, or what she's planning to say tomorrow. I need you to sit with what you did and didn't do tonight. That's not fair. It's very fair. Call me when you're ready to talk about that part, not before. I ended the call and sat on the cold edge of the tub a long while, listening to Margaret's breathing, settle back into sleep through the thin door. Across town, I found out much later, Vivienne had taken Connor's phone out of his hand the moment the call ended, scrolled through it, nodded once, and set it face down on the nightstand. She wasn't worried. She'd seen this pattern play out before. Gerald Fenwick would cool down. He always did. She had no reason yet to believe this time was different. Sunday morning, Connor called at 8, then 9:15, then 9:45. I let all three go to voicemail. Margaret's phone rang just after 10 while we sat across from each other at the small hotel table, her still in her robe with her coffee. She looked at the screen. Vivienne then looked at me. Your call, I said. She set the phone face down and wrapped both hands around her mug instead. 15 minutes later, a text from Connor, Dad. Vivienne is sorry. She wants to talk. We all need to talk, please. I typed back. When you're ready to talk about what happened, not to explain Vivienne, but to talk about what you did, call me. No response for 4 hours. Pam joined us for breakfast at a diner down the road. Eggs, strong coffee, a window booth looking out over an ordinary Sunday, people walking dogs, a kid on a bike, the whole world entirely unaware that anything had ended or begun. How are you actually doing? Pam asked. Not great, I said, but better than I expected to be. She nodded, and that was enough. Back at the hotel, I opened my email. A message from Trevor, sent at 7:12 that morning. The Lakeshore Selection Committee was meeting Monday. Connor's firm was still on the short list. The committee had questions about references and professional network. Trevor would be present for the discussion. He hadn't asked me what to do. He'd simply laid out the facts. I read it twice, closed the phone, and looked out at the Sunday afternoon arriving. For the first time in years, I didn't reach for my phone to make a problem disappear. I let it sit, I let it breathe, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like the right thing to do. They showed up Monday morning without calling ahead. I heard the car pull into the driveway from the kitchen. Margaret was at the counter. She looked at me, and I dried my hands. Connor's jaw was set the way it does when he's braced for something. Vivian wore a cream blouse, composed, deliberate. She dressed for this the way you dress for a meeting. You've prepared talking points for. We sat in the living room. No coffee offered. That was new. Vivian folded her hands in her lap and looked at me directly. Mr. and Mrs. Fenwick, I owe you an apology for my behavior on Saturday. I'm sorry if what I said caused pain. Sorry if. The room went very quiet. Vivian, I said, a conditional apology isn't an apology. She held my gaze. I'm not sure what more you want me to say. Then I'll be specific. You struck my wife across the face in front of 300 people. You told her nobody wanted her there, and your husband, my son, said nothing. I looked at Connor. What I want is for you both to understand what that cost. Not what it cost the bridge between our families. What it cost my wife, who has done nothing in 29 years, but loved this family without condition. Connor's voice cracked slightly. Dad, I froze. I know I froze. I've never seen anyone hit my mother before. I didn't know what to do, and by the time I did, it was already over. You had 4 seconds before it was over, I said, and about 400 after, while we were still standing there, you found none of them. He looked down at his hands. Vivian's composure flickered for the first time all morning. I lost my temper. I've never done anything like that in my life. I don't know what came over me. I believe that, I said, and I did. But losing your temper doesn't explain choosing the words you chose. Get out. Nobody wants you here. That wasn't an outburst. That was something you'd been carrying and waiting to say. She didn't have an answer for that. I told them both calmly that Margaret and I needed time. Not forever, I said, but real time, and a real apology when they were ready to give one, not a managed one. Connor asked, almost in a whisper, if this meant we weren't coming to Sunday dinners anymore. It means, I said, that for now, you come to us when you're ready to be honest about Saturday, and not before. They left a little after 11. Margaret cried for the first time since the wedding, not from sadness exactly, more like something finally being allowed to surface after being held flat for 3 days. I held her on the couch a long while. Tuesday, Trevor called from the Lakeshore Committee meeting. Connor's firm had been quietly moved off the short list, not for the technical work, which everyone agreed was strong, but on what the committee minutes described as concerns regarding professional conduct and references that couldn't be substantiated favorably. Nobody on that committee knew Connor was my son. Nobody needed to. Trevor hadn't said a word against him. He'd simply stopped vouching, and it turned out a great deal of Connor's network in this town had been built, quietly, on the goodwill of men like Trevor, who'd known me 30 years, and never thought to mention it. Connor found out Wednesday. He called me white-hot with anger, certain I'd sabotaged him on purpose, certain this was punishment dressed up as principle. I let him finish. Connor, I said, I didn't make a single call against you. I made one call to a friend, telling him I wasn't going to keep covering for things I used to cover for. That's all that happened. The rest of it is just the truth, catching up to a reputation you've been building without me holding it up anymore. He was quiet a long time. You've been holding it up? For longer than you know, son. Every favor, every reference, every quiet word, in the right ear. I never told you, because I never wanted you to feel like you owed me anything for it. I wanted you to feel like you'd earned it yourself. I think somewhere along the way, you started to believe you had. It took him almost 3 weeks to call back and actually talk. Not negotiate, not explain Vivian's stress levels. Just talk. He told me he'd been having trouble sleeping. He told me he kept replaying the 4 seconds at the bar, over and over, the way you replay the moment you didn't jump in front of a car for someone. He told me Vivian had gone to see a counselor on her own, hadn't asked him to come, hadn't told her parents. He told me he didn't know yet what that meant for the marriage, only that something in him had finally stopped looking away. Margaret and I had Sunday dinner alone for 11 weeks straight. On the 12th week, Connor came by himself first, sat at our kitchen table, and apologized to his mother with no conditions attached to it at all. Just an accounting of every moment he should have stood up and hadn't. Going back further than that wedding, further than Vivienne. Back to every small surrender I'd taught him without meaning to. Margaret cried again, but it was a different kind of crying this time. Vivienne came 2 weeks after that on her own, no script this time as far as I could tell, and the apology she gave my wife was the first one in 2 years that didn't have an exit built into it. I won't tell you everything's repaired. Some things you can sand and refinish, and some things you can only learn to live around, the way you live around a crack in a foundation that isn't going anywhere, but also isn't going to bring the house down if you respect it. Connor and Vivienne are still married. I see my son most Sundays now. Vivienne still comes sometimes, and when she does, she speaks to Margaret directly, and Margaret still opens her arms the way she always has, because that's simply who she is, and I've stopped trying to protect her from her own generosity. I never raised my voice that night, not once, not at the table, not in the parking lot, not on the phone at 11:20 when my son told me his wife was sorry for something she hadn't actually apologized for. I didn't need to. 35 years building things taught me the only lesson that ever mattered. You don't shout at a crack in the foundation. You find out what's underneath it, and you decide, quietly, what you're willing to build on top of.